We'd like to begin this podcast by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Hello everyone, welcome back. It's episode 26 of Talking Couch Potatoes. Hi Mel, how are you?
Hi Matt, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm not too bad for a young bloke.
That's good.
Doing pretty well so far with the podcast. We're 29 countries listening to us. Just wanted to mention that again. Mel, I wanted to start this episode a little differently if it's all right with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we have a bit of fun on this episode. I love Talking Couch Potatoes. But sometimes we have some somber things happen. And this time it's quite personal to the podcast.
That's right.
Our beautiful producer, Gemma, is coming in today to produce this podcast, and it's literally the day after her beautiful father, Rob Fittock, passed yesterday. Mm-hmm. And I just want to dedicate today's podcast to Gem's dad, Rob.
Absolutely.
And I know that the treasure of his life was his little sugar plum fairy, Gem. And what I know of Rob is that he was an extraordinary community activist in many ways. And I know that he worked with a lot of vulnerable, underprivileged communities. He was a big supporter of St. Patrick's. And I just wanted to take a moment, Gem, and just wanted if you could share a little story about Rob, about his experience with Greyhounds and his love of the work that you did. And the reason we're here recording this, by the way, on the day after his passing is because Gem was sure and determined that it's what her dad would have wanted.
Yeah. Well, he was very proud of us starting the podcast. He really admired the fact that we just went ahead and did it, even though none of us knew what we were doing. But he always did tell a story about how the one and only time he ever went to the Greyhound races was for a function in Cannington, and us kids went along because it was a family outing, and there were a few collisions on the track. And he was appalled, and he took us all home and vowed that day that he would never ever go back or bet on animals at all. So he saw straight away the carnage, which is, just really speaks to the sort of person he is. He saw that, he knew it was wrong. Yeah.
And what I've discovered through all the outpourings and messages that I maybe didn't know as much as I should have was how much he cared about the vulnerable in the community. He was on councils. I know he cared a lot about the work I do with vulnerable youngsters. So the fact that he saw one event, he saw one thing of some pain happening to these creatures and decided I'm not buying into that anymore.
Yeah,
it speaks a lot to who
all.
he is.
I was just going to say, we often have the discussion, I guess, people looking at footage of things that make them uncomfortable and saying, I don't want to see that because I don't like it. But in response to that, I've said to people, if everybody could just maybe have one look, and this is the perfect illustration of that. If you just have one look, it doesn't have to be catastrophic, but the more and more we turn away from just even wanting to acknowledge that it's occurring, we're just never going to fully understand what these animals go through. Yep. So it's just,
I think you're talking about bearing witness.
Exactly.
Bear witness.
And making that decision.
Yeah. So maybe Rob could be an example for others. It's a blood sport. Yep. The definition of a blood sport, look it up. Yep. Death, pain and injury for the sake of entertainment.
Choice. What a bloke though doing that. That's awesome.
So Rob, this is dedicated to you. And
we promise we'll look after your girl.
All right, Mel, what's going on lately? What's happening in the Greyhound advocacy world?
Well, the petition is still kicking along. We're at, I think, closer to 22,000 signatures now.
Good. And it's the paper-based one we're doing now, isn't it?
Yeah. The online one has finished because that only gets a limited amount of time on the website. So we're hoping to get that tabled very soon in Parliament. What else? Just one other thing that I would to acknowledge is at a national level that the transport of dogs from the East Coast to the USA for rehoming is starting up again. And Emma Hurst has just brought out a story of a dog that literally, very sadly, and a bit of a trigger warning, died on the tarmac at one of the airports in the US because it was left in the crate. So this is just another part of the rehoming crisis. Is
So this
simply
is-
not having enough homes here, too many dogs, sending them offshore is not the answer.
So this is one of the stopgaps,
Yep.
the fixes that this industry's tried to bring in,
Yes.
which is to say we don't have capacity to manage the dogs we're breeding, the dogs we're racing to
Yep.
rehome.
Yep.
Let's send them
Yep.
off.
Offshore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
That sounds
Yeah. It's not solving any problems for the dogs.
no.
You
It's
know,
putting
and
the
while-
problem somewhere else.
Exactly. We're just sending it offshore. And while it's fantastic the work that the US rescues are doing to try and rehome these dogs over there, and we thank them for that, it is not going to help greyhounds in the long run as a breed in Australia.
Mel, there's something else going on. The Great Global Greyhound Walk, which is happening actually this weekend on Sunday at Piney Lakes Reserve. Is that right?
That's right. There is also one happening in Busselton for Busselton Greyhound Awareness, so anybody down
nice.
that way.
Hello,
And
Busso.
Yeah, it's definitely worth going on to the Great Global Greyhound Walk website and having a look at walks in your area because they're all over the world.
Just like this podcast, Mel.
Yes, exactly.
We're global.
So hop onto the website.
So if you're on the globe, if you happen to live on the globe, say you're on the globe,
Yeah.
there's a great global walk happening. It happens to be happening on our part of the globe on Sunday the 29th, which is this Sunday at Piney Lakes Reserve. Starts at 8 a.m,
Yes,
so get up early.
yes.
And for the flat
Have a look.
earthers, Mel, what do they do?
Yeah, you'll have to join the rest of us on the globe for this one. And then we also have one of the most important days of the year for us is the tabling of our petition on the 15th of October at 11 a.m. outside Parliament House.
So would you like a mob of people to
We'd
turn up?
love
And,
a lot of people to come
yeah?
to turn up and just show support for the greyhounds.
Do you want me to take the day off, Mel? And-
Yes, I do.
Yeah?
Yes.
All right.
So bring your houndies if they're friendly. If it's too hot, please do not bring them because we just don't know what the weather's doing. But yeah, we need as many people there as possible.
Yeah, let's make a noise.
Yeah.
These hounds, the only noise they can make is a bit of chattering,
Yep.
maybe a bit of like singing, like Georgia.
Georgia.
But they can't raise their voice and say, please stop killing us, please stop hurting us, please stop maiming us,
Exactly.
just so you, Bob, can chuck a punt on. So we're their voice, aren't we, Mel?
Absolutely.
So
Yep.
rock up and let's make that voice loud. Mel, I'm a bit busy for the rest of this podcast. I've got things to do.
You're going to go and have a boys session with Bo.
Yeah, you remember that Bunny and I went to get our nails
done.
We've got Daddy Bo Day
Uh-huh.
today. Yeah, we've already booked it in. Bo just said, can we just go to the park and run around naked? That's all he wanted.
So without a collar on.
No, he wants me to be
Oh.
naked. Yeah, no, he said, Dad, can you please be naked too, Dad? And I love him so much. So yeah, we're going down to Vic Park. Anyone who's in Vic Park today, be careful. So I'll have to head off soon.
Okay.
I might have a collar on because I do need to be on a leash. But I do know you have an amazing interview, actually. The people you know, Mel,
Well,
honestly.
They want to help the greyhounds.
You've
That's
got,
the
you've
issue.
got connections.
Yeah, with people that run around naked in Vic Park.
That's a connection you'd like to sever. Ben's coming in today.
That's right. Ben Cave, yep.
Ben Cave, and he is the CEO of
RSPCA.
RSPCA WA. Good luck.
Thanks.
I'll see you then.
So, hi Ben, thank you so much for coming today and joining us here on the podcast. As Matt said, you're the current CEO of the RSPCA WA. Would you be able to just give us a short history on the RSPCA and how it came to be, I guess?
Yeah, of course. First, thank you for having me on the podcast today. That's really appreciated. RSPCA WA is about 132 years old. We started by a group of people concerned with horse welfare in Western Australia. And here we are 132 years later, the first society outside of the UK to get royal patronage. So we are the first royal society outside of the UK, which we're proud of. And we're a multifaceted organisation. A lot of people know us for very different things. So what are some of those things? We obviously have our inspectorate, which enforces the law on behalf of the WA state government. We have our shelter for rehoming and rehabilitating animals. Then we have education programs. We have our community outreach programs, our community action days. And we have our advocacy function as well, where we advocate for improvements in animal welfare and animal welfare legislation.
Yep, so that's a lot of hats to be wearing.
It It is indeed, and I think what happens is we become known by some people for some things we do, and we probably could tell our story better about how many varied different functions and many hats we wear.
Yeah, because that's something that I think, and that was for our listeners, that's why I was compelled and bugging you so much to come on the podcast, was because we always get people saying, but why won't the RSPCA step in and do something about greyhound racing? And that's where I also, when I started learning about greyhound racing, was that the RSPCA really don't have a lot of control or power to do anything about greyhound racing.
Yeah, and I think there's two key things to look at there. Firstly, there's our inspectorate powers. And we get a lot of people saying, why don't you do more with your inspectorate powers to change an industry? But that isn't what our inspectorate powers are for. Our inspectorate powers are to enforce the Animal Welfare Act. And we're very clear that we don't enforce the Animal Welfare Act for any other outcome apart from enforcing the Animal Welfare Act. We can't use those powers to forward an advocacy position that we want to see improvements in greyhounds or any other industry, and we never will. Never the twain shall meet. Our inspectorate and advocacy are completely separate. But that doesn't mean that we're not doing anything, because we do advocate for improvements in the industry, and we do advocate whenever we see issues, and that's a separate piece. But we'll never use our inspectorate for an advocacy purpose.
Yep, that's right. And also legislation, as we know, having myself not been in it nearly as long as you have, but with the Animal Welfare Act, is a long way behind in being updated, and the actual power within that legislation that the RSPCA have is quite antiquated, to say the least.
That is to say the least. The Animal Welfare Act was actually reviewed by a panel led by Linda Black back in 2019, and again we're advocating to government to take the recommendations from those reviews and produce an amendment bill. And why is that? Because the Animal Welfare Act, as it's written, isn't fit for purpose. And what do I mean by that? Practices are allowed that you and I would find abhorrent and distressful, but they're allowed under the Animal Welfare Act for a number of reasons. So what to anybody in the street looks like something is terrible and something should be done, to use that term, is simply not an offence under the Act. And our powers come from the Act. They don't extend beyond it, and they're not constrained in any way other than what is written in the Act.
That's right. So your power to take somebody to court, say, or to remove an animal off of somebody is only if it fits within that current legislation. And if it doesn't, you can't spend any more time on it or energy, because you're not going to get any kind of outcome that you would want.
That's right. And look, our goal isn't a prosecution or isn't to take animals away from people. Our goal in our enforcement role is to get compliance with the Act. We use a model that's called VAID, so we try to get voluntary compliance where people voluntarily comply with the Act, and that is the best way to get compliance, because people will keep doing it. Then we use the assisted compliance, where we will help people, we'll educate people, we'll provide free food and things to make sure that in the long term they can look after their animals. Then we get directed compliance. Directed compliance is where we write direction notice to say you must do this. And right at the end of that process is enforced compliance. And enforced compliance is a prosecution. In reality, it means it's a failure of those other three methods that we've not managed to get compliance through that. And we never go into a case thinking we're going to prosecute this. We go into every investigation saying we'll investigate that case on its merits, on the facts. That might lead to a prosecution, but ultimately it's about getting compliance with the Act.
Yeah. And how often do people comply with it? Majority of your cases, what level, or is it just too varied to know?
It's too varied, but it's staggering, the numbers. So last year we got about 17,500 calls to our animal cruelty line. That led to over 7,000 investigations and about 45 to 50 prosecutions out of that. So all those other calls we simply go, that isn't an issue under the Animal Welfare Act, so they're not valid calls for us to investigate. So that goes from the 17.5 to the 7. And then we get the 7,000 plus investigations that we investigate each one on its merit. And 6,900 or whatever the number is of those we get compliance through those other three methods. It's a very small fraction that we prosecute, because prosecution and a criminal prosecution is really serious, and we don't take those powers lightly.
Yep. And also, I guess for people listening, is what are the numbers of staff or inspectors and things that you have? Like, how difficult does that make it for you to be able to follow up things? because as I understand it, you don't have enough to cover the massive state that we have.
No, look, we don't. And I'll be honest, we've just gone through a real change in operating model. So until the 1st of July this year, our inspectors were out in the field on their own. I've been out with our inspectors. They knock on the worst door, in the worst street, in the worst suburb. And they were going to those houses with no forewarning of what they'd find, alone to go and address an animal welfare issue. That has been a big issue for me for a long time. We had 10 inspectors last year to handle those 7,000 plus investigations. So the numbers are huge. The workload on our inspectors are huge. On the 1st of July, we've recently changed to a 2-out in the field operating model. And that's simply we can't keep putting old people at risk. So we've now insisted that all jobs are responded to by 2 inspectors. They go 2 out. That means our ability to cover those 7,000 jobs is constrained even more. And we've taken a leap of faith. We're actually looking to double the size of our inspectors and get up to around 20. That will result in a significant loss of money for us this year. What we're hoping is the state government will come and fund inspectorate properly, so it can operate in a manner that we're proud of how it operates, and it can operate in a manner that the community sees is an Animal Welfare Act properly enforced by a properly resourced organisation.
Because you're not fully funded by the government, are you?
No, we're not. So if we look at last year, it cost about $4.5 or just north of $4.5 million to run the inspectorate operation. And we got about 1.3 from government for that. So we pour in, over the last few years, we've on average poured in $3 to $3.5 million a year to operate the inspectorate and the associated costs. Over the last decade, over $23 million is what it's cost us from donated funds to operate the inspectorate and enforce the law.
Yeah, and that's only that part of your organisation. That's without the rescue, without the shelters, without the other parts to it.
That's exactly right. So that includes the rehabilitation of animals that come to us through that work, but we obviously get animals from everywhere else as well. And it doesn't include anything like our education. It doesn't include any of our advocacy work, any of our community outreach work. Now, we're fortunate. We've got an amazing supporter base. We've got an amazing donor base. We've got some really big corporate supporters who help us deliver that mission. If the government was funding the inspectorate on its own, it would cost them at least twice what it costs us to operate.
And then Greyhound trainers and participants, they got $26 million in prize money. And that is from, whether you like it or not, no matter how you frame it, it is taxpayer funded. So that's why we think the government should shut down greyhound racing and start to put this money back into the huge crisis we have already and get that under control.
I think you're absolutely right. So this is enforcing legislation just the same as the West Australian Police Force do. And I don't think anybody would accept the WA Police being partially funded by government and needing to go and raise money to enforce the laws that they enforce. I think it's a quirk of history that Animal Welfare Acts are enforced by RSPCA on a part-funded method. And I think realistically going forward, community expectation towards animal welfare has changed and funding models have to change as well. Look, we talk about the top of the cliff and the bottom of the cliff work, which goes back to a very famous poem about philanthropy generally. And there's a cliff that people fall off. And at the bottom of the valley, they've got a great ambulance service that keeps picking the people up when they've fallen off the cliff. But they could stop all that happening if they built a fence at the top of the cliff. And the reality is that we spend all our money on the bottom of the cliff work, subsidising the enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act, whereas we'd be far more effective if we were spending that money at the top of the cliff and preventing cruelty and improving legislation before it happens.
Absolutely. And what are some of the things legislatively, because the Animal Welfare Act still hasn't been finalised, what are some of the major things that you would like to see?
Look, I think we're really fortunate, and what we hope is that when that Animal Welfare Amendment Bill comes to Parliament, it will include the 50-plus recommendations from the report of the review panel, and over 30 of those points and recommendations were directly recommended by RSPCA WA, and we took part and were involved in that panel quite significantly. So what we want is to see that amendment bill come to Parliament and be enacted, because that will make the Act more fit for purpose and more aligned with community expectation for animal welfare.
Yeah. And also another bit of legislation that's just coming through, the puppy farming bill. How does that affect the RSPCA?
Now, the unusual thing with the puppy farming bill is those powers fall to local government rangers. They are under the Dog Act, their Dog Act amendment. They will help the RSPCA because we deal with a lot of puppy farms and backyard breeding. So there's two ways that you can stop that happening. Currently, we find out of welfare concerns with those establishments and those people, and we go and act under the Animal Welfare Act. But there's nothing legally to stop them carrying out that. So if they breed dogs and overbreed dogs, but they're done in a pleasant way or a pleasant environment, then that may not be an offence under the Animal Welfare Act as it stands. And that's the point I make earlier, that things that we just see are completely wrong don't constitute an offence under the Animal Welfare Act. So the Stop Puppy Farming Bill and the amendments to the Dog Act should actually bring some legislation to stop those things happening in the first place.
Yep, great. So which in turn will then help you at the back end, as you say, at the bottom of the cliff.
Exactly
being
right.
the ambulance.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other important thing there, though, is community demand. And puppy farmers, backyard breeders, selling dogs out of car boots at shopping centres, at community fairs. The people who buy those animals, which think they're doing a good job, they want a nice animal, they're being duped, and they're funding this industry because they make a lot of money. Backyard breeders make a lot of money, and they will keep doing it as long as they can keep on making that money. And as long as there's community demand, that money will keep running in. Yeah. So there's an obligation on the community at large to actually help prevent that and help deal with that problem.
We had Karen from the Dogs Refuge Home on a few episodes ago, and she said the same thing. We need to really make this shift of rescued dogs. Let's change that mindset. She said in the UK, if you were at a party and said, oh, you got a such and such from a breeder, they'd be like, what, you didn't get a rescue dog? It was a bit like smoking. You just don't do that anymore.
That's right, and that is community attitude that has changed. And as I say, I think the good thing is people are becoming more aware. And as that awareness grows, what we see from that is we see two things. We see the awareness growing, so demand going away. But as community awareness grows of animal welfare, we see more demand on our services. Every year we receive more calls, we investigate more investigations. And there's a question, is that because there's more cruelty? I personally hope that's not the case, because that's a very poor reflection on us as a society. And I hope and I believe that it's because people are becoming more aware of animal welfare. And I think the other thing is, for RSPCA, an overwhelming majority of cases that we investigate and properties that we go to, there is a human welfare issue there as well. We'll put stories of what we're dealing with on social media, and we'll find two sets of comments, one very compassionate about the situations that people are going through. We'll find other people commenting of, if you can't afford a pet, don't have it, or I'd rather give up my house and my job and live in my car to protect my pet, not realising that that's what many people are doing. They are going without a lot of other things because that pet owner bond is so important to them.
Yeah.
And I think the one good thing we can say about Australia is, as a whole, Australia is a country of animal lovers. There are more pets in Australia than there are people. We're overwhelmingly a nation of animal lovers. And I think that's why we see an increase in cases, because of that awareness. And you can be an animal lover even though you're doing it tough in life.
Within the legislation, what is okay for a dog or a cat or an animal to be living in? What situation?
So here's the thing. So I'll use an example that I was talking to somebody about last night. A dog kept in a backyard on a 1.5 metre chain. It's got sufficient shelter, it's got sufficient food, it's got sufficient water, but its life is spent on a 1.5 metre chain in a backyard, and that is its entire life. That's no offence. That's not an offence right now. So again, something that would seem abhorrent and you think, how could anybody keep an animal that way, isn't actually an offence under the Animal Welfare Act. And that's an example that I use. It's very difficult to make broad brush examples because every case stands on its merit and on the investigation of an individual case. But that's an example that I use because it highlights that it's not the community's expectation of what RSPCA should be doing and what our animal welfare laws should allow.
Yeah, and I fully expect that it kills all of your inspectors and all of the people that work within that area of it. That is acceptable. I bet they don't walk away from any of those cases that they can't do anything about feeling good.
I'll use an example from a few years ago where an inspector on a weekend went and rescued a dog. and our vet clinic wasn't open, so it was taken to a local vet clinic. The local vets were so traumatised by what they saw, the state of that animal. They put up a GoFundMe page. They wanted to raise funds for that animal. It was the worst animal they'd seen. It probably wasn't the worst animal our inspector had seen that week, never mind forever. And the reality is it takes a huge toll. And I'll be honest, when we get criticisms, people saying we don't do enough, when we get criticisms, people saying, oh, you kill too many dogs, they need to come and walk a mile in the shoes of our inspectorate and the shoes of our staff, because nobody works at RSPCA to see animals suffer. But the reality is the constraints of the Act and constraints of resources means that we have to see it, and there's very little we can do in many occasions.
Yeah, it was one of the things I met you guys years ago now, was the first time, because I was going in there and I'm going to find out why you guys won't do anything. And I think we spent an hour in a meeting the first time, and it really changed my whole outlook on what you guys are able to do. And then that's what made Free the Hounds go down that legislative route, or looking at that more heavily, because that's where the issues really do lie. For any of us to be able to do anything about greyhound racing, about any animal welfare, the whole lot, it's all about what is going on within legislation, and how we as a community then either accept it or don't accept it. So with the upcoming election, I think it's really important that people speak to their MPs or look at what the policies are that each of these parties wants to bring to the table for our state going forward. But I do remember I came out to the RSPCA a few weeks ago to look at a little ginger cat. We went out there and he had ringworm, and he was kept in a quarantined area. He had a TV, and there was this eagle and birds on the screen for him to watch. He had a radio. He had this huge play area for him to be in. You had to put your shoes in this liquid to clean them. There was hazmat that the volunteers or your staff would put on. And I'm just thinking, this for one little kitten, and you're getting criticism for not doing other things, but they don't see what goes on there. I was gobsmacked. I don't know of any other organisation that's community funded predominantly would go to those lengths for just one kitten.
And thank you for that comment, because I think, as you've said, many people are happy to accuse RSPCA of many things, but the reality is every single person at RSPCA goes to work to get the best outcome for animals. And if that's what it takes for the best outcome for that animal, then that's what it takes. We're incredibly fortunate to have an amazing team of volunteers, and we do go that extra mile to get the right outcome.
Because then I met with Karen from the refuge, and she was telling me what our council pounds don't do. And this isn't to say it's all of the councils, but many of them. They don't do any desexing. They don't do any vet work for these animals that they bring into the pound. They've put them out to you guys, to other refuges, and then the community pays for it. Whereas with greyhound racing, the desexing, the dental work, the euthanasia, it's all paid for by the taxpayer.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I think local governments have an impossible role to play as well. They often complain that state government makes legislation and then they wear the cost of enforcing it, and I won't get involved in that little argument. But I think one thing that we'd like to see, because of those issues that we see in pounds, is mandatory reporting for outcomes from animals going into pounds, because we see that varying. And there's 137 local government authorities in Western Australia, and the outcome of an animal very much depends on which LGA it is in when it goes into a pound. And we think there should be mandatory reporting so people can see the real outcomes and the real costs of the animals that go through those pounds.
And then start maybe talking to their MP about the way that things are carried. Because knowledge is power, and until the public know what happens in these different areas, how can they be asked to help, you know?
You're right. Knowledge is power, because where there isn't knowledge, rumour and intrigue creep in.
Yeah, and they're usually far more exciting.
Absolutely. And you talked earlier about RSPCA being criticised by anybody and everybody, and that the reality is that we are. We have a view that if we're being criticised by people who are very, and I don't want to use the word activists because we're all activists in our own way, but if we're criticised by people who are at more extreme ends of activism, and we're criticised by industries, whatever that industry is, then we're kind of in the right place for what we're doing. We're about science in our advocacy work and respectful conversations to try and make change over the long term. Now, that won't be enough for some people and will be too much for other people, but it's a tried and trusted way for RSPCA. We've been seeing animal welfare improvements for 132 years, and we hope to see them in the next 132 years as well. We're as frustrated as anybody about the length of time change takes. It's an example that I use, hens in cages. The review of the standards and guidelines took 8 years, from the agricultural ministers coming together, all state and territories at AgMin, to start reviewing that and looking at a way forward for hens in cages. That process took 8 years, with a 15-year phase out at the end of that. So 23 years for us to decide and finally get hens out of cages. It's astounding how slow this legislation moves for animal welfare.
And why do you think they do set these massive phase outs?
I think there's so many stakeholders, and as government, you have a responsibility to consult with every stakeholder. I don't think it's an easy problem to solve. But I think it's, for the people on the animal welfare side of the discussion, it's frustratingly slow. But I can understand why state governments go through the process they do, or all governments go through the process they do, and they have to listen to every stakeholder. And I think there's statistics that show that. As I talked earlier, the reports of cruelty to RSPCA WA increase year on year. I think that reflects society saying, no, these things aren't acceptable anymore. And I think we talk about hens in cages and caged eggs. The community has taken that decision long ago. You struggle to buy caged eggs in supermarkets because where the community sees caged eggs, they go, we don't want them. We've taken that decision. It's where they don't see them in cakes, in baked goods, in all of those egg products that still come from hens in cages. I know from talking to people say, what do you mean hens are still in cages? And the reality is, in their mind, they think that discussion has been had and been resolved and finished long ago. It's the hidden eggs, and I think that contributes to the fact that it takes a long time, but it's a good reflection that the community won't accept poor welfare anymore. And I think, unfortunately, what happens is that the people, the producers who do pretend things aren't going to change, are the ones who unfortunately get caught out when decisions are made. And progressive producers are well ahead of the curve, and they've moved on, they've seen the future. Farmers especially are amazing. They deal with weather, they deal with unknown outcomes year in, year out. They're great planners, they're great adapters. And many farmers are really progressive. And a couple of things I was going to talk about today, in fact, was mulesing. Now, mulesing is only permitted, it's a horrific act, it's only permitted because there's a defence under the Animal Welfare Act. If people understood what mulesing was, there'd be a huge outcry. A lot of progressive farmers have moved on and don't mulese, voluntarily taken that decision. We'd love to see mulesing a phase-out date for mulesing in however long we think by the end of the decade, to get those less progressive producers to actually come to the table and start having discussions about how they can do things differently as well. And I think that's in every industry, progressive producers, and you see the, I won't say recalcitrant, those less open to change, who have to be dragged rather than leading the way.
And what would be the percentage of those, do you think, in Western Australia, the progressive to the sort of old school, if you like?
From a percentage perspective, I wouldn't like to guess, but what I would like to say is I meet a lot of very progressive farmers who do, and I think every farmer, I believe, has animal welfare at the heart of what they do. But I see a lot of progressive farmers who say, I don't think that is good welfare, so I'm going to do things differently. And I think there's a huge number of progressive farmers in Western Australia.
Yeah. See, I think you're right there. I think farmers do think, and not just farmers, I'm just using that because of our discussion, but they do feel that they love their animals. That's like greyhound trainers. I'm sure they feel that they love their animals. I don't think that their definition of love is necessarily the same as the regular community idea might be, or what it is if you haven't grown up around that or been exposed to that from a very young age, or some people say you're desensitized to it, which I think in a way you are if you've grown up like that. But just because something has been done for a long time or in a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct either.
No, that's absolutely right. We'd still, as a global population, we'd still be doing horrific things if an argument for keeping doing something is the fact that we've always done it. So I think change takes a long time, but change does occur.
Yeah, amen. Was there anything else you wanted to touch on, or?
We talked earlier about why aren't we doing more to improve the greyhound industry? We are, and we're waiting for another meeting with the minister, which will be meeting next month. But we do that in that respectful way, and not in a. We will never be holding placards. That's just not what RSPCA does. Yeah. But that doesn't mean to say that we're not doing anything. But we don't use our inspectorate for advocacy goals. Our inspectorate is a law enforcement agency, and it's a model prosecutor. It has its own prosecutions policy based on the DPP prosecutions policy. It's a standalone operation that enforces the Animal Welfare Act. But that doesn't mean we're not doing things, as I say, because we have our advocacy work that we do. We probably don't do it as publicly as a lot of other people.
Yeah, which you would find difficult anyway, because obviously you do have to get funded by the government. So to a degree, and also you have from a national perspective to look at too. Like WA can't go rogue from the rest of the country with the umbrella of RSPCA, can you?
No, we can't. I will be brutally honest though and say we don't shy away from our advocacy because of our government funding. It constrains us in no way. We're very clear how we operate. The government funding is to pay for a service or part pay for a service. It's a difficult conflict to manage. We're often wrongly accused of not doing as much because of our government funding. It's absolutely incorrect. Our advocacy work is funded by donations and donors, and we will keep doing that until the cows come home to get the right outcomes for animals. Government funding is all about enforcing the Animal Welfare Act, operating a law enforcement agency.
So that's a service that they're paying you to do, basically, isn't it? So if you look at it that way, it's not actually funding as in here you go, use this for what you want. It's a fee for service from the government. It's
absolutely a fee for service. We acquit that. We provide fully audited accounts on how that funding is spent. And as I say, that funding funds less than a quarter of the enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act. And so we're often accused of, you get government funding, you get all the money. We don't. It is a fee for service, and it's a part fee for service, a very small part fee for service.
No, that's a really good point. Okay, thank you so much, Ben, for coming in today, and perhaps we might be able to get you back in later on after the puppy farming bill has really kicked off and see how that's all going. Because I know we would love greyhounds to be included in that, and I actually spoke to Minister Beasley recently about that, just if there is some oversight somehow brought in. Yeah. I know there's been some chatter about those sorts of things occurring also, but
I would love to come back. I think you guys do amazing work. I think the other thing I would like to say is that this government has made some real change to animal welfare. The Stop Puppy Farming Bill, when it's enacted and comes into power, will make a real change. We're not a political party. We don't play political sides. But it is good to see some movement in that animal welfare space because, as I say, it's glacially slow in its progress. So any progress is a bonus. Personally, very happy to come in here. And as I say, any time. Thank you for the opportunity.
No worries. Thanks so much.
Mel, I wish I had been here for that.
Yeah, Ben's a lovely guy. Really nice person.
And thank you, Ben, for making your time as well. And thank you to all of the people who come and make their time for this podcast.
Exactly.
Because we don't pay any guests.
No.
I don't get paid. I do it purely for the love of greyhounds.
Exactly.
You do it just to spend time with me, Mel, I know. But thank you to Ben for being here for that one. Jem, I think Jem does it... I got nothing. So thank you so much, Ben. Very informative, and we need to be informative. We can be kind of fun as well, but
we just really want our listeners to remember and to think about the fact that it's the legislation that constrain organisations more than it is about what they actually want to do.
Okay, so there's a public sort of motivation and impetus for change. But the legislation is what is constraining that change.
Exactly. Yep.
So we need to make a noise then. And as you said, the petition's being filed on the 15th of October. That's a good time to make some noise.
Absolutely, before an election.
Yeah. And we've said before, Mel, that you can also call your local rep and say what the hell's going on.
Yeah.
You can
Just
email
as
them.
Georgie Purcell, listen to her episode number 2. She was just informative and told us, again, get off your bums and do something.
And the greyhound community is growing. We know
absolutely.
that. And we love the people who take these greyhounds in and look after them and give them a beautiful life. And that's lovely and wonderful. But if you really want to change things for all greyhounds, then be a little social activity.
Absolutely.
And we only need 8,000 more signatures before the 15th of October to get to that magical 30,000
That's right,
mark.
yeah.
I think that brings us to the end of our day today, Mel. I just want to once again give a big shout out. Mel, you're probably the greatest activist I've ever met in terms of protecting and advancing the cause of these beautiful creatures. But very close next to you is our wonderful producer, Gemma. And I just want to give a big shout out again to her amazing dad. So cheers to Rob.
Cheers to Rob.
Let's get together. Let's stay together. Let's make a noise so that we can release the hounds.